Alright, a tip if you're using raisins, don't shred your raisins. If they contain wild yeast, this will happen. The yeast will eat the sugar inside the grapes and it'll create CO2 bubbles and alcohol. They'll float to the top. Then the distiller's yeast will be here at the bottom doing its work, creating bubbles, stirring everything around in here, bringing it up to the raisins, and then the raisins are almost like a second level of fermentation. So because there's got to be yeast culture growing all over those raisins, not just inside of them. But the evidence that it's inside of them is that these raisins are floating to the top, which means they have CO2 bubbles inside of them. So using raisins, don't shred them, and then this will happen. And I'm sure if you use the clearing agent, it's not hard to separate everything. And then even if they stay floating at the top, whenever you do your siphon, you would just start there and then end there and leave the raisins. And what I'm going to try to do is actually, instead of throwing everything out that is everybody else calls gunk, that is actually a yeast culture, and I'm going to keep it and try to do a whole nother ferment with the same yeast and maybe the same raisins. I'm not sure. I'm just going to see what happens, because it's just bacteria that's making the alcohol. So I'm going to try to make it last more than one generation, and because that's what like any big brewer, that's what they do. Their family passed down the yeast strain that they've been farming for generations. And so like what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to mix wine yeast, which is grapes. I'm going to mix wild yeast, it's wild wine yeast, and then distiller's yeast, and then I'm going to get some champagne yeast also, and breed those all together and get a microscope, and then pick which parts of the culture I want to keep so I can continue that and make my own strain of yeast that is a mix between wine, champagne, and distiller's yeast that does exactly what I want it to do. So yeah, this is actually working out pretty well. This is my first ferment ever. So I'm just pointing out some tips that I'm noticing as I'm going along. Because if you look, there's not a bunch of bubbles going through, but there are bubbles. And then at the top it's like crazy bubbles. That's because all the bubbles from the bottom are coming up, and then there's like a secondary ferment happening at the very top. Because all those raisins, all around those raisins, alcohol is being made. Alright, just wanted to talk about that.